that was an underground thing, you know.
Yeah.
She worked there all her life.
Who is this?
And I'm trying to think of her name. And we were visiting. She went back to the old farm, and she was living in the old farmhouse when we went to visit her. And her son, Gaylord, lived in Omaha. The whole family did, because she had a couple kids, at least one. And her husband was a womanizer. And they lived in around Burlingame, one of those small towns.
Yeah.
Her husband was a womanizer, and he drove a gasoline truck.
Yeah.
And he had an accident with a gasoline truck, and he had his girlfriend with him, and they both burned to death.
Oh, jeez.
You know, they're fried.
Wow.
But she had the baby, and she moved up to Omaha for some reason, got the job as a secretary to the generals and all that stuff there, and she spent her whole life up there. And when she retired, she came back to the old family house that her father and mother lived in. And her mother was Charlie's sister.
My grandfather's sister.
Yeah.
So what does this have to do with Saudis? The house that she came back to was a sod house?
No, the Saudis was her grandmother on the other side, Downey, that's the Irish now.
Okay.
We're talking Scotch on that side.
Okay.
And the Irish, Grandma Downey, who pretty much brought Sharon up from a baby all the way to high school age.
Yeah.
She was with her all the time because everybody was working and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
She was from Ireland, and she started out living in a sod house when they came over.
Oh.
You know, everybody did, and all they do is cut the sod and stack it and put some kind of a thatched roof or whatever on it, and that's what they lived in.
Yeah.
And this other aunt on the other side made a comment that something about cooking or what. She cooked a meal for us. Sharon says, "You're a great cook," and she said, "Well, I'm a lot better cook than your Grandma Downey, who Sharon was really close with, because she was a Saudi, and these Saudis never could cook worth a damn anyway," she said.
Yeah.
And she was very opinionated. And she smoked like a fiend. And I went there one time to visit her, and John and Abby was with us. She lived in this house all by herself. And she showed me the paperwork on a house to build a house and barn in 1920 something. The total cost was $640.
Wow.
But that was probably like 600,000 today. Who knows, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but anyway, so she had oxygen hose like your mother.
Yeah.
And she's sitting in a chair, and I'm talking to her. I'm standing in front of her, and she started turning blue or some color, and she said, "Would you mind?" She says, "You're standing on my hose."
Oh,
You know, and she was a tough woman. I mean, she was she brought herself up all her life, and
Yeah.
she probably made a lot of money and all that, but she was a piece of work, I'll tell you. And back then, they bought these radios at Radio Shack, little square radios, and had a battery in them. And it was National Weather Service, and it started beeping like crazy when there was a tornado warning. And then there was a recording. It would come across the radio, saying there's a tornado sighted in a certain county.
Now this is in Burlingame, Kansas?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it went off one time when I was there, and they were talking about a tornado, but it was in a different county.
Yeah.
But that's what, and we're talking back now, probably in the 70s, you know, maybe.
Yeah.
And they all had these little radios.
I remember the one time we went back to visit, it might have been the late 60s or something, but it was the year before a big tornado had hit Topeka.
Oh, yeah.
And we drove through the section of town
Right.
that was all ripped up.
That was interesting because 1966 is when that happened.
Okay.
And we went to Topeka probably 2 years later. So 68, 69, maybe 70. You know, we went.
But there was still.
And we lived on a street in Topeka when we first got married. We rented an apartment, second floor of a Victorian house. You know.
Yeah.
Mrs. Palmer, it was her name. I don't know why I remember it. And she, we lived in that house when we went down that street. Driving down the street, we were headed south, because all the streets are north, south, east, and west there. On the south side of the street, for probably 100 yards or 200 yards, there was no houses. The tornado came down, went up again. The houses on the right were fine, and everything beyond there were fine. The house we live in was just wires sticking out of the ground, you know.
Wow.
And we had lived in that house in '56, so it was probably 10 years.
Later, it got wiped
Yeah,
out.
yeah, you know, it was unbelievable. And it went down the main street of Topeka, right down the main street, Kansas Avenue, that tornado. And there was a lot of tall, by their standards, not really skyscrapers like New York, but several stories, maybe 20-story high
Yeah.
or whatever. And all the glass was blown out of a lot of these buildings, you know, because they were all glass, you know.
Yeah.
And but that avenue was really wide too for some reason. For some reason, when they built all these buildings, they were really wide, the streets, you know.
Now, what was that you were telling me recently was in the text about that, the Brown versus the Board of Education thing or whatever? Remember when the high school was first integrated or something like that?
All right, Sharon's mother and father got a divorce and she was 13 years old, okay?
Yeah.
And then they closed the diner thing, you know, the cafe. And Sharon and Thelma and Downey moved to Topeka because Thelma got a job in Topeka.
And took Grandma Downey with her.
Yeah, and Grandma Downey went everywhere because she did all the work, right?
Right.
And so for 1 year, Sharon lived in Topeka, and she was 13 or 14 years old. She was actually high school age. She had to be older than that, and she went to Topeka High.
Okay.
And she hated it, but she went to Topeka High at the time that article. You know, she didn't know anybody because it was a school, 1,000 kids. I don't know what. She was high school, and she really hated it coming from Burlingame, where there's probably 10 or 15 kids in the class.
Yeah.
And she did 1 year in that school, and it happened to be her junior year in high school.
Okay.
So now she went back to Burlingame and stayed with a friend's house for her move back there, but her mother still stayed in Topeka.
So she did her senior year back in Burlingame.
Yeah, so she graduated from the Burlingame High School, and she went there 3 years, and she missed out on a class trip to Washington, D.C. because they would only have a class trip every 2 years.
Oh.
In other words, so they had as a junior, she would have went on a class trip with the seniors, but when she went back, she missed, and she regretted missing that trip to Washington because everybody had been there and all that stuff, you know.
Yeah.
So, and that high school now is a museum that she went to. It's called the Schuyler Museum. And when you go in there, it's pretty interesting because there was a woman, an old maid school teacher, everybody loved her, English teacher. And they had her bedroom set up in that high school in a room with her actual bed with a canopy and all that.
Yeah.
Her dresser, and Sharon really liked that,
Yeah.
and everybody loved that teacher. She was an old maid teacher. She taught for, I don't know how old, as long as she could. And they had a fire truck, a 1930s fire truck in there, restored. And it was a fire truck in Burlingame back in the 30s. And then somehow it ended up in Branson, Missouri, which is quite a ways from Topeka. And somebody totally restored it to like a new condition, you know, it was like a 39 Ford or something.
Yeah.
And the person who restored it, when he passed away, his family gave it back to the town of Burlingame. It was sitting in a mock firehouse inside that school, you know what I mean?
Right, now that was this, so that was that, getting back to that Brown versus the Board of Education.
Yeah.
That was where the Supreme Court made a decision that they were forcing the school to integrate or something like that.
Yeah.
And so that happened when Mom was there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they must have had reporters.
But she didn't even know that until she read it in the paper.
Okay, so
20 or 30 years later, that article in the paper she had cut out, or her mother sent it to her or something.
okay, so it wasn't like there was.
She didn't even know about it.
So it wasn't like there was big reporters running all over the hallway or anything like that.
I don't think there was many black people in Topeka at that time.
Yeah.
The minority were Mexicans there when I was there.
Yeah.
You know, the slums and all that. There was no Puerto Ricans and there was no black people to speak of
Right.
at that time. But, you know, it's all different now.
Yeah. Times change.
Yeah, so